Number 1. Erin Caffey, the cheerleader who orchestrated her family's massacre. Erin Caffey appeared to be everything a small-town Texas family could hope for in a daughter. At 16 years old, she was a bright-eyed cheerleader with blonde hair, a warm smile, and a reputation for being deeply involved in her church community. The Caffey family lived in Alba, Texas, a quiet rural town where everyone knew everyone, and the idea of violent crime seemed as foreign as life on another planet. Terry and Penny Caffey had built their lives around their faith and their children, homeschooling Erin and her 2 younger brothers, Matthew and Tyler, in an effort to provide them with strong moral foundations and protection from the darker influences of the modern world. Their home was modest but filled with love, laughter, and the sounds of gospel music. Terry worked as a trailer park manager while Penny devoted herself entirely to raising their children, and together they created what seemed from the outside to be an idyllic family unit rooted in traditional Christian values. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect family, a dangerous obsession was growing in Erin's heart, one that would lead to one of the most shocking family annihilations in Texas history. In early 2008, Erin had begun dating Charlie Wilkinson, an 18-year-old boy she had met through mutual friends in the local community. What started as innocent teenage romance quickly escalated into an all-consuming relationship that concerned Terry and Penny deeply. They noticed changes in their daughter's behavior, a defiance they had never seen before, a willingness to lie and sneak around that was completely out of character for the girl they thought they knew. Charlie was not the kind of boy the Caffeys wanted their daughter involved with. He had dropped out of school, had no real prospects for the future, and seemed to bring out a rebellious streak in Erin that frightened her parents. As the relationship intensified, Terry and Penny made the decision that countless parents have made throughout history when they believe their child is involved with the wrong person. They forbade Erin from seeing Charlie anymore. They grounded her, took away her phone, and made it clear that this relationship was over. For most teenagers, this would have resulted in tears, arguments, and eventually acceptance as they moved on with their lives. But Erin Caffey was not most teenagers. Instead of accepting her parents' decision, Erin became consumed with rage and resentment toward the 2 people who had given her life and dedicated themselves to her well-being. In her immature and distorted teenage mind, her parents had become obstacles standing between her and true love, enemies who needed to be eliminated rather than authority figures acting in her best interest. She began to plot their murders with a chilling determination that would horrify everyone who later learned the truth. Erin reached out to Charlie, and together they devised a plan that was as brutal as it was calculated. She also recruited Charlie's friend Charles Wade, who was 20 years old, and Wade's girlfriend Bobby Johnson, who was 18, to participate in the massacre. The plan was simple in its horror. Charlie and Charles would go to the Caffey home in the middle of the night, murder Erin's entire family, and then Erin and Charlie would be freed to be together without any interference. On the night of February 29, 2008, Erin set the plan in motion by making sure she would not be in the house when the killers arrived, giving herself an alibi while ensuring she would survive the attack she had orchestrated. At approximately 3:30 in the morning, Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade arrived at the Caffey home armed with multiple weapons, including guns and swords. They entered the house and immediately opened fire on the sleeping family. Terry Caffey was shot multiple times, the bullets tearing through his body as he struggled to understand what was happening in the chaos and darkness of his own bedroom. Penny Caffey was shot in the head, dying almost instantly as she lay in bed beside her husband. The killers then moved through the house hunting for the 2 young boys, finding 13-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Tyler and shooting them execution style as they cowered in fear. But the killers were not finished with their atrocities. After murdering the family, they poured gasoline throughout the house and set it ablaze, hoping to destroy any evidence of their crimes and make it appear as though the family had died in an accidental fire. As flames engulfed the Caffey home, Charlie and Charles fled the scene and picked up Erin, who had been waiting nearby, pretending to be a distraught daughter who had just lost her entire family. However, what the killers did not know was that Erin Caffey had survived the attack. Despite being shot 5 times, despite losing massive amounts of blood, despite suffering from smoke inhalation and severe burns, Terry managed to crawl out of his burning home and make it to a neighbor's house where he collapsed and emergency services were called. When first responders arrived at the scene, they found a fully engulfed house fire with 3 bodies inside and 1 critically injured survivor who could barely speak but was trying desperately to tell them something. Erin Caffey was rushed to the hospital where doctors worked frantically to save his life, not knowing if he would survive the night. The investigation began immediately, with fire marshals and law enforcement officers working to determine what had happened at the Caffey home. Initially, there was confusion about whether this was a home invasion gone wrong, a targeted attack, or something else entirely. But as Erin Caffey stabilized and began to recover enough to speak with investigators, the horrifying truth started to emerge. Terry told detectives that he had seen the attackers, that they were young men, and most shockingly, that he believed his daughter Erin might have been involved. The investigation quickly focused on Erin and her boyfriend Charlie Wilkinson, and within days, all 4 conspirators were arrested and taken into custody. During interrogations, the full scope of the plot was revealed, with each participant blaming the others but ultimately admitting their roles in the murders. Charlie Wilkinson confessed that Erin had been the mastermind behind the plan, that she had repeatedly asked him to kill her family, and that he had agreed because he loved her and wanted to be with her. Charles Wade similarly stated that Erin had orchestrated everything and that they were simply following her wishes. Bobby Johnson, who had driven the getaway car and helped with planning, also confirmed that Erin had been desperate to have her family killed, so she could be free to live her life with Charlie. The evidence against Erin was overwhelming and included witness testimony from her co-conspirators, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and her own inconsistent statements to police. What emerged during the investigation was a portrait of a teenage girl so consumed by infatuation and so lacking in empathy that she was willing to murder her own mother, father, and 2 innocent younger brothers just to continue a relationship her parents had forbidden. The case went to trial, and the proceedings revealed details that shocked even seasoned prosecutors and investigators. Text messages between Erin and Charlie showed that she had been planning the murders for weeks, discussing different methods and scenarios, and repeatedly urging Charlie to follow through with the plan. She had told him exactly when to come to the house, where everyone would be sleeping, and what to do to make sure no one survived except her. During the trial, prosecutors presented Erin as a cold and calculating killer who had shown no remorse for her actions, and who had even smiled and joked with Charlie in the hours after her family was slaughtered. The defense attempted to portray Erin as a manipulated victim, suggesting that Charlie and Charles were the true masterminds and that Erin had been coerced or brainwashed into participating. But this argument fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence showing that Erin had been the primary instigator. Erin Caffey, who had lost his wife and 2 sons and had nearly lost his own life, chose to attend the trial and face the daughter who had tried to have him murdered. In one of the most emotionally devastating moments in modern courtroom history, Terry testified about the night his family was destroyed, describing the terror and pain and confusion, and then he did something that stunned everyone in the courtroom. He forgave his daughter. Through tears, Terry told the court that he still loved Erin, that he had forgiven her for what she had done, and that his faith required him to show mercy even in the face of such unimaginable betrayal and loss. This act of forgiveness did not, however, translate into leniency from the justice system. Erin Caffey was convicted of 3 counts of capital murder and 1 count of attempted murder, and despite her age and her father's forgiveness, she was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 25 years. The judge made it clear that the brutality of the crimes, the premeditated nature of the murders, and the complete lack of remorse shown by Erin warranted the harshest possible punishment. Charlie Wilkinson was also sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, as was Charles Wade, while Bobby Johnson received a lesser sentence of 40 years due to her more limited role in the actual killings. Erin is currently incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, where she will spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. In the years since her conviction, she has claimed to have found religion and expressed remorse for her actions, writing letters to her father and asking for his continued forgiveness, though many observers question the sincerity of these expressions given her complete lack of empathy at the time of the crimes and during the trial. Terry Caffey, meanwhile, has rebuilt his life in the most remarkable way possible, remarrying and becoming a motivational speaker who travels the country sharing his story of forgiveness and faith. He has written a book about his experience and works to help other families dealing with troubled teenagers, though he has said that not a day goes by when he does not think about Penny, Matthew, and Tyler. The Erin Caffey case remains one of the most disturbing examples of patricide and matricide in American criminal history, a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most innocent and beautiful faces, and that the capacity for violence exists even in those we would least suspect. The case has been studied extensively by criminal psychologists trying to understand what could drive a teenage girl to commit such heinous acts against her own family. And while theories abound ranging from immature brain development to pathological narcissism to possible undiagnosed mental illness, there is still no fully satisfactory explanation for how a 16-year-old cheerleader from a loving Christian home could transform into a family annihilator. The tragedy of the Caffey family serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of teenage obsession, the importance of parental boundaries, and the sometimes unfathomable capacity for human cruelty, even among those who appear most innocent and unassuming. Number 2. Jennifer Pan. The perfect daughter's perfect crime. Jennifer Pan appeared to be the embodiment of the model immigrant child, a young woman who represented everything her Vietnamese-Canadian parents had sacrificed so much to achieve. Growing up in Markham, Ontario, an affluent suburb of Toronto, Jennifer was held up as an example of academic excellence and dedication by her parents, Huey Han Pan and Bitch Ha Pan, who had come to Canada with nothing and built a comfortable middle-class life through hard work and determination. The Pans had invested everything into their daughter's future, enrolling her in piano lessons, figure skating, and maintaining relentless pressure for her to achieve perfect grades that would lead to admission to a prestigious university and eventually a lucrative career in medicine or pharmacy. To the outside world, Jennifer appeared to be fulfilling this dream perfectly, telling her parents and everyone around her that she was a star student at Ryerson University studying pharmacology, maintaining a near-perfect grade point average, and volunteering at hospitals to pad her medical school applications. Her parents beamed with pride whenever they spoke of their daughter's accomplishments, seeing her as proof that their sacrifices had been worthwhile and that the Canadian dream was real for those willing to work hard enough. But every single detail of Jennifer's perfect life was an elaborate lie, a facade she had been constructing for nearly a decade to hide the truth that she was a complete failure by her parents' exacting standards. The deception had begun in high school when Jennifer started struggling academically, unable to maintain the perfect grades her parents demanded while also pursuing her relationship with a boyfriend they disapproved of and engaging in a social life they knew nothing about. Rather than face her parents' disappointment and anger, Jennifer made a fateful decision. She began forging report cards, creating fake transcripts, and lying about her academic achievements. When she did not get into any of the universities she had applied to, she fabricated an acceptance letter from Ryerson University, complete with a fake scholarship, and for the next several years she maintained an elaborate deception that would have been impressive if it were not so tragic. Every morning, Jennifer would leave the house pretending to go to classes at Ryerson, but instead she would spend her days at coffee shops, libraries, or her boyfriend Daniel Wong's house, killing time until she could return home at the appropriate hour and tell her parents about her day at university. She created fake transcripts showing perfect grades, forged documents about scholarships and academic awards, and even went so far as to pretend to attend a graduation ceremony, having her parents drop her off at the university where she claimed the ceremony was being held, only to spend the day walking around campus before returning home to celebrate her fake degree with her unsuspecting family. For years, this double life continued, with Jennifer's lies growing more elaborate and more unstable with each passing day. Her parents, meanwhile, continued to tighten their control over her life, imposing strict rules about who she could see, where she could go, and what she could do with her time. They particularly disapproved of her relationship with Daniel Wong, whom they viewed as unmotivated and unworthy of their daughter, and they forbade Jennifer from seeing him, though she continued the relationship in secret. By 2010, Jennifer was 24 years old and the web of lies was becoming impossible to maintain. Her parents were starting to ask questions about her career prospects, wondering why she had not yet been accepted to pharmacy school despite her allegedly perfect academic record, and the pressure was mounting to a breaking point. Jennifer found herself trapped between two irreconcilable realities: the perfect daughter her parents believed her to be and the failed, directionless young woman she actually was. Rather than come clean and face the consequences of years of deception, Jennifer made a decision that would shock the nation and destroy what remained of her family. She decided to have her parents killed. The plan Jennifer developed was complex and designed to make the murders look like a random home invasion gone wrong, allowing her to inherit her parents' estate, collect their life insurance, and finally be free to live her life with Daniel without restrictions or expectations. She reached out to people in Daniel's circle who she knew had connections to the criminal underworld, eventually making contact with individuals who agreed to carry out the murders for $25,000. Jennifer spent weeks planning every detail of the crime, discussing logistics with the hired killers, and preparing herself mentally for what was about to happen. On the evening of November 8, 2010, Jennifer put her plan into action with chilling precision. She made sure she was home with her parents that night, knowing that she would need to be present to let the killers into the house and to establish her cover story as a victim rather than a perpetrator. At approximately 10 o'clock that evening, 3 men entered the Pan home through the front door, which Jennifer had left unlocked for them according to the plan. The intruders were armed and immediately took control of the house, ordering Jennifer and her parents into different rooms. According to Jennifer's later testimony to police, the men tied her hands loosely behind her back and took her upstairs to her room while taking her parents to the basement where they demanded money and valuables. Jennifer claimed that she heard gunshots ring out from the basement and then silence, followed by the intruders fleeing the scene. When police arrived at the house after a frantic 911 call, they found a horrific scene. Huai Han Pan had been shot in the face and shoulder and was clinging to life despite catastrophic injuries, while Bitch Ha Pan had been shot multiple times and was dead at the scene. Jennifer was found upstairs with her hands loosely tied, claiming to be a traumatized victim of a random home invasion. In those first hours after the shooting, investigators treated Jennifer as a victim and a witness, focusing their initial efforts on finding the perpetrators of what appeared to be a home invasion robbery. But as detectives began interviewing Jennifer and examining the crime scene more carefully, inconsistencies started to emerge that raised serious red flags. Jennifer's account of the events was extremely detailed, almost too detailed, and she seemed remarkably composed for someone who had just witnessed her mother's murder and her father's near death. The way her hands had been tied was suspicious, so loose that she could have easily freed herself, and there were no signs that the intruders had actually searched the house for valuables despite Jennifer's claims that this was a robbery. Most importantly, when Huai Han Pan miraculously survived his injuries and was able to communicate with police from his hospital bed, his account of what happened that night differed significantly from Jennifer's version. Huai Han told investigators that he had seen Jennifer talking to the intruders, that she had been walking around freely and not restrained like she claimed, and that she had seemed to be directing them rather than being victimized by them. This bombshell revelation completely changed the direction of the investigation, and detectives began to suspect that Jennifer was not a victim but rather the orchestrator of the attack. They conducted multiple interviews with Jennifer over the following days, and with each interview, her story changed slightly, contradictions emerged, and the evidence against her mounted. Phone records showed that Jennifer had been in contact with several individuals connected to Toronto's criminal underworld in the weeks leading up to the murders, and financial records revealed discussions about payments that matched the contract price for the killings. Under intense interrogation, one of the hired killers eventually confessed and provided detailed information about Jennifer's role in planning the murders, confirming that she had arranged everything, provided them with information about the house layout and her parents' routines, and had specifically instructed them to make the scene look like a robbery gone wrong. On November 22, 2010, just 2 weeks after the attack, Jennifer Pan was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, as neighbors and friends struggled to reconcile the image of the perfect, dutiful daughter with the cold-blooded murderer who had orchestrated her own parents' executions. The trial, which began in March 2014, became a media sensation as the full scope of Jennifer's deception and the brutal nature of her crimes were revealed to the public. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence including phone records, witness testimony from the hired killers who had agreed to testify against Jennifer in exchange for reduced sentences, and most damningly, the testimony of Hugh Ihan Pan himself, who had to face his daughter in court and recount how she had betrayed him and murdered his wife. The prosecution argued that Jennifer had been motivated by a toxic combination of greed, desperation to escape her parents' control, and a complete inability to face the consequences of her years of deception. They painted a picture of a young woman so consumed by her lies and so lacking in moral character that she viewed murder as a more acceptable solution than simply telling the truth. The defense attempted to portray Jennifer as a victim of her parents' unrealistic expectations and controlling behavior, suggesting that years of emotional and psychological abuse had driven her to a breaking point where she felt murder was her only option for freedom. They brought in expert witnesses to discuss the psychological impact of growing up in a household with such intense pressure and rigid expectations, arguing that Jennifer's actions, while criminal, were the result of years of trauma and manipulation by her parents. However, this defense strategy was largely unsuccessful, as the jury found it impossible to reconcile any level of parental pressure with the cold, calculated nature of Jennifer's crime. The prosecution effectively argued that millions of children grow up with strict parents and high expectations without resorting to murder, and that Jennifer's actions were not those of a desperate victim but rather those of a selfish, manipulative individual who wanted her parents' money and freedom from their rules without having to do the hard work of building an independent life. The testimony of the hired killers was particularly damaging, as they described in detail how Jennifer had planned every aspect of the murders, how she had shown no emotional distress when discussing killing her own parents, and how she had been primarily concerned with making sure she would inherit their estate and not be suspected of involvement. On December 13, 2014, after a trial that had lasted 9 months and included testimony from over 40 witnesses, the jury found Jennifer Pan guilty on all charges. She was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of her mother, attempted murder in the shooting of her father, and conspiracy to commit murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the harshest sentence available under Canadian law. In pronouncing the sentence, the judge noted the particularly heinous nature of the crime, stating that Jennifer had betrayed the deepest bonds of family and trust, had shown no genuine remorse for her actions, and had demonstrated through her elaborate lies and manipulations that she posed a serious danger to society. Jennifer Pan is currently serving her sentence at the Grand Valley Institution for Women in Kitchener, Ontario, where she will remain until at least 2035 when she becomes eligible for parole at the age of 49. Her case has been the subject of numerous documentaries, podcasts, and articles examining the psychology behind her crimes and the broader issues of parental pressure in immigrant communities, the dangers of perfectionism, and the devastating consequences of choosing deception over honesty. Huey Hanpan survived his injuries but has lived the remainder of his life with the knowledge that his daughter tried to kill him and succeeded in murdering his wife, a burden that no parent should ever have to bear. The Jennifer Pan case remains one of Canada's most notorious patricide cases and serves as a chilling reminder that the pressure to be perfect, combined with a willingness to lie and a lack of empathy, can create a deadly combination that destroys families and ruins lives. The tragedy of the Pan family demonstrates how the pursuit of an idealized version of success can become toxic when taken to extremes, and how the inability to accept failure or imperfection can lead even seemingly normal young people down a path toward unthinkable violence against those who love them most. Number 3. Paris Bennett, the genius who murdered his baby sister. Paris Bennett was not an ordinary child by any measure, and from his earliest years, it was clear that he possessed an intellect far beyond his age. Born in 1993 to Charity Lee, a young single mother who was still a teenager herself when Paris entered the world, Paris demonstrated signs of exceptional intelligence almost immediately, speaking in full sentences before most children his age had mastered basic words, reading at a college level by the time he was in elementary school, and displaying a fascination with complex topics like psychology, criminology, and human behavior that was remarkable for someone so young. His IQ was tested at various points during his childhood and consistently measured in the genius range, well above 140, placing him in the top 1% of all children his age. Charity Lee, despite her young age and the challenges of being a single mother, was immensely proud of her brilliant son and did everything in her power to nurture his gifts and provide him with opportunities to excel. The family lived in Abilene, Texas, and while they did not have much money, they had each other, and Charity was devoted to creating a loving home for Paris and his younger sister, Ella, who was born when Paris was 4 years old. Paris seemed to adore his baby sister, often helping to care for her, playing with her gently, and showing what appeared to be genuine affection for the little girl. To everyone who knew the family, Paris was a remarkable child, polite, articulate, and mature beyond his years, the kind of boy who would surely grow up to do great things and make his mother proud. But beneath the surface of this gifted child's mind, something dark and twisted was growing, a fascination with violence and a complete lack of empathy that would remain hidden until it was far too late. On the evening of February 4, 2007, when Paris was just 13 years old and Ella was 4, Charity Lee made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She went out for the evening with friends, leaving Paris to babysit his little sister. Paris had babysat Ella many times before without incident, and Charity had no reason to believe this night would be any different from the dozens of other times she had entrusted her children's care to her responsible older son. What Charity did not know was that Paris had been planning for this night, waiting for the perfect opportunity to act on urges he had been harboring for some time, urges to kill, to see what it would feel like to take a life, and to inflict maximum emotional pain on his mother by destroying the thing she loved most after him. At approximately 10 o'clock that evening, while Ella was in her bedroom preparing for bed, Paris entered the room with a knife he had taken from the kitchen and launched a brutal attack on his defenseless little sister. What followed was a scene of such horror and brutality that even experienced homicide detectives, who later investigated the crime, were shaken by the evidence. Paris stabbed Ella 17 times, continuing the attack long after the little girl had stopped moving, ensuring that she was absolutely dead. The wounds were not random or frenzied. They were deliberate and placed in locations that would cause maximum damage, demonstrating a calculated approach to killing that was chilling in its precision. After murdering his sister, Paris did something that revealed the true depth of his depravity. He sexually assaulted her body. This additional act of violence was not committed out of sexual desire. As Paris would later explain to psychologists, but rather as a deliberate choice designed to maximize the trauma his mother would experience when she learned what had happened. Paris understood that his mother would be devastated by Ella's death, but he wanted her suffering to be as complete and unbearable as possible. And he knew that learning her daughter had been sexually violated would add an additional layer of horror to an already unimaginable tragedy. After committing these atrocities, Paris calmly picked up the phone and called 911, reporting that there had been an emergency and that his sister was hurt. When police and paramedics arrived at the house within minutes, they found Paris waiting for them, calm and collected, with blood on his hands and clothing, and they found Ella's small body in her bedroom, surrounded by a scene of carnage that made it immediately clear this was a homicide. Paris was taken into custody immediately, and during the initial interview with police, he confessed to killing his sister with a level of detachment and lack of emotion that shocked the experienced detectives questioning him. He explained that he had killed Ella specifically to hurt his mother, stating that he wanted to destroy his mother psychologically and emotionally, and that he had chosen to kill Ella because he knew she was the person his mother loved most in the world besides himself. He described the murder in clinical detail, showing no remorse, no sadness, and no recognition that he had done anything morally wrong. When asked why he would want to hurt his mother, whom he claimed to love, Paris explained that he was angry with her for reasons he could not fully articulate, and that he wanted her to suffer for the rest of her life knowing that her decision to go out that evening had resulted in Ella's death. The psychological evaluations that followed Paris's arrest revealed a complex and deeply disturbing portrait of a young man with psychopathic tendencies, an extremely high intelligence, and a complete absence of normal human empathy or conscience. Multiple forensic psychologists examined Paris and concluded that he met the criteria for psychopathy, displaying the characteristic traits of superficial charm, grandiosity, manipulativeness, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, and a parasitic lifestyle. What made Paris particularly dangerous was the combination of his psychopathic personality with his exceptional intelligence, creating an individual who was not only willing to harm others without guilt, but who was also smart enough to plan and execute complex schemes and to manipulate those around him. During his evaluations, Paris openly discussed his fascination with serial killers, his interest in studying criminal psychology, and his desire to experience what it felt like to kill another human being. He expressed no genuine remorse for murdering Ella, viewing her death primarily as a means to an end in his goal of punishing his mother. He also revealed that he had been planning the murder for some time, waiting for the right opportunity when he would be alone with Ella and when the crime would have maximum impact on charity. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by Paris's age at the time of the crime, as he was just 13 years old when he murdered his sister. Under Texas law, juveniles can be certified as adults for particularly serious crimes, and prosecutors immediately sought to have Paris tried as an adult given the premeditated and brutal nature of the murder. However, after extensive legal arguments and evaluations, it was ultimately decided that Paris would be adjudicated as a juvenile, meaning he would be sentenced under the juvenile justice system but could be held until he turned 19, at which point his case would be reviewed to determine if he should be released or transferred to the adult prison system. In 2007, Paris Bennett was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in the Texas juvenile justice system with the possibility of parole after serving half of his sentence. The judge who sentenced him noted that Paris was one of the most dangerous individuals he had ever encountered in his courtroom, despite his young age, and expressed serious doubts about whether Paris could ever be safely released back into society. Paris was sent to a juvenile detention facility where he would remain until he turned 19, at which point he would be transferred to an adult prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. Throughout his incarceration, Paris has continued to demonstrate the same lack of empathy and remorse that characterized his crime, though he has become more skilled at presenting a facade of rehabilitation to parole boards and prison officials. He has participated in various educational programs, earned his GED, and taken college courses through correspondence programs, using his exceptional intelligence to excel academically while incarcerated. However, those who have interviewed him extensively, including his own mother, report that beneath the veneer of normalcy and achievement, Paris remains the same calculating psychopath he was at 13, still fascinated by violence, still lacking genuine human connection, and still viewing other people primarily as objects to be manipulated for his own purposes. Charity Lee, Paris's mother, has become an advocate for victims of violent crime and has been remarkably open about her experience losing one child to murder and another child to the criminal justice system. She has given numerous interviews over the years, describing the impossible grief of losing Ella and the complex, painful emotions she feels toward Paris, whom she still loves as her son despite knowing that he murdered her daughter specifically to cause her pain. Charity has stated that she believes Paris is a true psychopath who will never genuinely feel remorse for what he did and who poses a serious danger to society if ever released. She has also revealed that Paris continues to write to her from prison, letters that she describes as manipulative attempts to maintain control over her emotions and to ensure she remains psychologically tied to him. In some of these letters, Paris has admitted that he still takes pleasure in knowing how much pain he caused his mother and has suggested that if he is ever released, he might commit additional crimes specifically designed to hurt her further. These admissions have led Charity to become a vocal opponent of Paris's potential release, testifying at parole hearings and working to ensure that the parole board understands the true nature of her son's psychopathy and the ongoing danger he represents. Paris Bennett's case has been extensively studied by criminal psychologists and has been featured in numerous documentaries and true crime programs examining juvenile murderers and psychopathy in children. The case raises troubling questions about how society should handle children who commit horrific crimes, particularly when those children show signs of psychopathy and a high likelihood of reoffending if released. It also highlights the limitations of the juvenile justice system in dealing with individuals who, despite their young age at the time of their crimes, demonstrate a level of calculated cruelty and lack of rehabilitation potential that suggests they may never be safe to release. Paris became eligible for parole in 2027, 20 years after murdering his sister, though as of now he remains incarcerated and his mother continues to fight against his release. The case of Paris Bennett stands as one of the most disturbing examples of filial murder in American history, a reminder that intelligence and charm can mask profound evil, and that some individuals, even children, may be fundamentally incapable of empathy, remorse, or rehabilitation. The tragedy that befell the Lee family serves as a heartbreaking illustration of how a single act of violence can destroy multiple lives simultaneously, leaving survivors to grapple with grief, guilt, and the knowledge that someone they loved was capable of unimaginable cruelty. For Charity Lee, the nightmare continues every day as she lives with the loss of her daughter, the betrayal of her son, and the fear that Paris may one day be released to potentially harm others. A burden that no mother should ever have to bear, but one that she has shouldered with remarkable strength and grace in the years since that terrible night in February 2007. Number 4. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, the girl who escaped a prison of lies. The story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard is unlike any other case in this list because it involves a young woman who committed murder not out of cruelty, rage, or selfish desire, but rather as a desperate act of escape from years of systematic abuse, medical torture, and psychological imprisonment at the hands of her own mother. Gypsy Rose was born in 1991 in Louisiana to Dee Dee Blanchard and Rod Blanchard, but her parents separated before she was born and Rod played only a minimal role in her early life, leaving Dee Dee as Gypsy's primary caregiver and, as would later be revealed, her primary abuser. From the time Gypsy was a small child, Dee Dee claimed that her daughter suffered from a multitude of severe medical conditions including leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, asthma, sleep apnea, and developmental disabilities that left her with the mental capacity of a 7-year-old despite her chronological age. Dee Dee presented Gypsy to the world as a severely disabled child who required constant medical care, and she devoted herself to being the perfect, self-sacrificing mother who gave up everything to care for her sick daughter. The community around them responded with enormous sympathy and support, raising money for the family, providing them with housing and assistance, and treating Dee Dee as a hero for her dedication to her disabled child. After Hurricane Katrina devastated Louisiana in 2005, Dee Dee and Gypsy moved to Springfield, Missouri, where Habitat for Humanity built them a specially equipped house to accommodate Gypsy's supposed disabilities, complete with a wheelchair ramp, a hot tub for therapy, and other modifications. They received substantial charitable donations, free trips to Disney World and other attractions through wish-granting organizations for sick children, and constant community support that made Dee Dee and Gypsy local celebrities of sorts. But everything about Gypsy's illnesses was a lie, an elaborate deception perpetrated by Dee Dee Blanchard as part of a mental illness called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, in which a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a person under their care in order to gain attention, sympathy, and other benefits. The truth, which would not be discovered until years later, was that Gypsy was not sick at all. She did not have leukemia or muscular dystrophy or any of the other conditions Dee Dee claimed. She was not mentally disabled, and she did not need a wheelchair or feeding tube or any of the medical interventions that Dee Dee insisted upon. Dee Dee had been lying to doctors, forging medical records, coaching Gypsy to appear sick and disabled, and in some cases actually making Gypsy sick through unnecessary medications and procedures. Gypsy's teeth had rotted and fallen out not because of medication side effects as Dee Dee claimed, but because Dee Dee refused to let her practice proper dental hygiene and may have actually damaged them deliberately. Gypsy could walk perfectly well, but Dee Dee kept her in a wheelchair and forced her to pretend she could not use her legs. Gypsy was of normal intelligence, but Dee Dee insisted she had the mind of a child and severely limited her education and social interactions. For years, Gypsy went along with the deception because she was too young to understand what was happening, and later because she was too afraid of her mother to resist. Dee Dee controlled every aspect of Gypsy's life with an iron fist, monitoring her constantly, restricting her contact with the outside world, punishing her severely when she stepped out of line, and creating an environment of fear and dependence that made Gypsy a prisoner in her own life. As Gypsy entered her teenage years and early 20s, she began to understand that she was not actually sick, that her mother had been lying about her conditions, and that she was capable of far more than Dee Dee allowed her to do. She started to secretly rebel in small ways, creating profiles on online dating sites, chatting with boys on the internet, and trying to explore a normal life that her mother had denied her. It was through these secret online activities that Gypsy met Nicholas Gojon, a young man from Wisconsin who had his own history of mental health issues and social difficulties. Gypsy and Nicholas began an online relationship that quickly became romantic and sexual, with Gypsy seeing Nicholas as her ticket to freedom from her mother's control. The two began discussing ways that Gypsy could escape from Dee Dee, and as their conversations progressed, the discussions turned darker and more violent. Gypsy wanted to be free of her mother, but she believed, perhaps correctly, that Dee Dee would never willingly let her go, that even if she tried to run away or contact authorities, Dee Dee would manipulate the situation and use Gypsy's supposed disabilities to maintain control. In Gypsy's mind, which had been shaped by years of abuse and isolation, the only way to truly be free was for Dee Dee to be dead. Nicholas, who was deeply infatuated with Gypsy and had violent fantasies of his own, agreed to help her kill Dee Dee, and together they began planning the murder. On June 14, 2015, the plan was set in motion when Nicholas traveled from Wisconsin to Springfield, Missouri, meeting Gypsy in person for the first time. Gypsy let Nicholas into the house late at night while Dee Dee was sleeping, providing him with duct tape, gloves, and a knife, and then she hid in the bathroom while Nicholas went to Dee Dee's bedroom and stabbed her to death. Dee Dee woke during the attack and tried to fight back, calling out for Gypsy to help her, but Gypsy remained hidden, covering her ears to block out her mother's screams until the house fell silent. After Dee Dee was dead, Nicholas and Gypsy took a taxi to a bus station, traveled to Wisconsin to Nicholas's house, and consummated their relationship, all while Dee Dee's body lay undiscovered in the Springfield house. Before leaving Missouri, Gypsy posted concerning messages on the Facebook page Dee Dee had maintained for her, writing things like, "That bitch is dead," which alarmed friends and family and prompted them to request welfare checks from police. When officers entered the Blanchard home on June 15, 2015, they made the shocking discovery of Dee Dee's body, and the investigation immediately focused on finding Gypsy, who was assumed to be a vulnerable disabled victim who had been kidnapped by whoever had murdered her mother. But as investigators delved into the case and located Gypsy and Nicholas in Wisconsin, the true story began to emerge, and what police discovered was far stranger and more complex than a simple murder. When authorities interviewed Gypsy, they were stunned to see her walking, talking normally, and showing none of the disabilities that medical records indicated she should have. As Gypsy told her story to investigators, revealing years of abuse, medical fraud, and control by her mother, police and prosecutors found themselves facing an unprecedented situation. A murder victim who had been abusing her killer for years, and a killer who had legitimate claims to being a victim herself. The revelation of Dee Dee's Munchausen syndrome by proxy and the extent of the abuse Gypsy had suffered created enormous public sympathy for Gypsy, with many people arguing that she had been acting in self-defense or under extreme duress and should not be prosecuted harshly. Medical examinations confirmed that Gypsy had none of the illnesses Dee Dee had claimed, that she could walk and function normally, and that she had been a victim of severe and prolonged abuse. However, prosecutors also pointed out that Gypsy had not been in immediate danger on the night of the murder, that she had planned and orchestrated the killing in advance rather than acting impulsively in a moment of crisis, and that she had options available to her other than murder, including simply walking away or contacting authorities. The case went forward and both Gypsy and Nicholas were charged with first-degree murder, though their cases were handled separately given their different levels of involvement and culpability. Nicholas Gojohn went to trial and was convicted of first-degree murder, with prosecutors arguing that he was the one who actually killed Dee Dee and that while he may have been manipulated by Gypsy, he was an adult with agency who made the choice to commit murder. Nicholas was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and is currently serving that sentence. Gypsy Rose Blanchard accepted a plea deal in which she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 10 years in prison. A remarkably lenient sentence given the nature of the crime, but one that reflected the extraordinary circumstances of abuse she had endured and the widespread recognition that she had been a victim long before she became a perpetrator. The judge who accepted the plea noted that Gypsy's actions, while criminal, were the result of years of severe abuse, and that she deserved an opportunity for rehabilitation and a chance at a normal life after serving her time. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was released from prison on December 28, 2023, after serving approximately 8 years of her 10-year sentence, having earned early release through good behavior and participation in prison programs. Her release became a major media event, with widespread coverage of her story and significant public interest in how she would adapt to life as a free woman after spending her entire youth either under her mother's control or in prison. Since her release, Gypsy has attempted to build a normal life, divorcing a man she married while in prison and trying to navigate the complexities of modern life with very little preparation or life experience. Her case has been the subject of multiple documentaries, a highly successful limited series on Hulu called The Act, and countless articles and discussions about the nature of abuse, victimhood, and justice. The Gypsy Rose Blanchard case raises profound questions about criminal culpability in situations involving long-term abuse, the responsibilities of medical professionals and social services to identify and prevent Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and the failures of systems that allowed Dee Dee to abuse Gypsy for decades despite numerous red flags that should have triggered intervention. Multiple doctors over the years had expressed concerns about the consistency of Gypsy's supposed conditions or the necessity of certain treatments, but these concerns were never properly investigated and Dee Dee was always able to manipulate the system to continue her abuse. The case also highlights the psychological impact of prolonged abuse and control, demonstrating how victims can become so trapped in their circumstances that they believe violence is their only escape option, even when alternatives might exist. While Gypsy's actions in planning and facilitating her mother's murder were undeniably criminal, there is widespread recognition that she was driven to those actions by years of torture, medical abuse, and psychological imprisonment that no person should have to endure. The public's largely sympathetic response to Gypsy's case, in contrast to the harsh judgment reserved for most matricide cases, reflects a collective understanding that not all mothers are victims and not all daughters who kill their mothers are simply cold-blooded murderers. Dee Dee Blanchard's abuse of her daughter was systematic, prolonged, and profoundly cruel, involving not just physical harm through unnecessary medical procedures, but also psychological torture through isolation, control, and the denial of Gypsy's very identity and capabilities. The case serves as a stark reminder that child abuse can take many forms, some of which are hidden behind a facade of devoted parenting and medical necessity, and that victims of such abuse deserve recognition, support, and a path toward justice and healing, even when they have committed crimes in their desperate attempts to escape. Gypsy Rose Blanchard's story is ultimately one of survival against impossible odds, of a young woman who endured years of abuse that most people cannot imagine and who made a terrible decision in her desperation to be free, a decision she has spent years paying for, but one that, in the context of her life story, becomes, if not excusable then, at least understandable in ways that other cases of parental murder are not. Number 5. Chelsea Richardson, the honor student who plotted a family massacre. Chelsea Richardson was, by all outward appearances, exactly the kind of daughter any parent would be proud to have. Growing up in a comfortable middle-class home in Port St. John, Florida, Chelsea excelled academically, maintained good relationships with her teachers and peers, and participated actively in school and community activities. Her parents, Judy and Scott Richardson, had worked hard to provide Chelsea and her younger brother, Cameron, with a stable, loving home environment and opportunities for success. Scott worked as a project engineer while Judy dedicated herself to being a full-time mother, and together they created what neighbors described as a picture-perfect family. Chelsea was enrolled in advanced placement classes, maintained a high grade point average, and seemed to be on track for college admission and a bright future. She had a boyfriend named Jacob Heindel who appeared to be a positive influence in her life, a polite young man from a good family who was also doing well in school. But beneath this veneer of normalcy and success, Chelsea was harboring deep resentments toward her parents that she kept hidden from nearly everyone around her. In early 2010, when Chelsea was 16 years old, she began complaining to friends that her parents were too strict, that they imposed unreasonable rules on her life, and that they were preventing her from living the way she wanted to live. These complaints were remarkably similar to the grievances of millions of teenagers throughout history who chafe against parental authority and rules, and to those who knew the family, it seemed like typical adolescent rebellion rather than anything seriously concerning. What no one knew was that Chelsea's resentment had evolved beyond normal teenage frustration into something far darker and more dangerous. She began discussing with Jacob the idea of killing her parents, initially presenting it as a fantasy or a joke, but gradually making it clear that she was serious about wanting them dead. Jacob, who was 16 years old and deeply in love with Chelsea, found himself drawn into these conversations and eventually into planning an actual murder that would destroy both families and end multiple lives. The plan that Chelsea and Jacob developed was startling in its brutality and its complete lack of regard for human life. Chelsea wanted both of her parents dead, and she wanted the murders to look like a home invasion or robbery gone wrong, so that she would inherit her parents' estate and life insurance proceeds and be free to live independently with Jacob. They discussed various methods and scenarios, eventually settling on a plan where Jacob would come to the Richardson home late at night, armed with a weapon, and would murder both parents while they slept. Chelsea would make sure she had an alibi or would present herself as a surviving victim who had been elsewhere in the house when the killings occurred. What made this case even more disturbing was that Chelsea's motivations for wanting her parents dead were shockingly trivial when compared to the magnitude of the crime she was planning. Her parents were not abusive. They did not beat her or starve her or subject her to any form of serious mistreatment. They simply imposed the kind of rules and expectations that most responsible parents establish for their teenage children. They had curfews. They wanted to know where she was and who she was with. They expected her to maintain her grades and contribute to household responsibilities, and they occasionally said no to things Chelsea wanted to do. These entirely normal and appropriate parental behaviors were, in Chelsea's immature and entitled mind, sufficient justification for murder. On March 2, 2010, Chelsea decided to put the plan into action, but what actually happened that night would differ significantly from what she and Jacob had planned and would ultimately lead to their capture and conviction. Jacob came to the Richardson home in the early morning hours armed with a knife, and he made his way to the master bedroom where Scott and Judy Richardson were sleeping. He attacked Scott first, stabbing him multiple times in what became a brutal and prolonged struggle. Scott fought back desperately, trying to defend himself and his wife, calling out for help and fighting for his life even as he sustained terrible injuries. The commotion woke Judy, who also began fighting against the intruder, and the violence escalated as Jacob tried to kill them both. In the chaos and terror of the attack, Cameron Richardson, Chelsea's 14-year-old brother who had no knowledge of the plot, woke up and came to investigate the sounds of struggle coming from his parents' room. When Cameron appeared, Jacob made a split-second decision that would haunt him forever. Rather than fleeing or allowing Cameron to call for help, Jacob attacked the boy as well, stabbing him multiple times in a desperate attempt to eliminate any witnesses to the crime. The scene in the Richardson home was one of absolute carnage, with blood everywhere and 3 people fighting for their lives against a frenzied attacker. What Jacob and Chelsea had not anticipated was the sheer difficulty of actually murdering another human being, especially people who were fighting desperately to survive. Despite being stabbed multiple times, Scott Richardson managed to survive the initial attack and was able to fight off Jacob long enough for help to arrive. Neighbors heard the screams and commotion and called 911, and police arrived at the scene within minutes to find Jacob still in the house and the Richardson family members suffering from multiple stab wounds. Scott Richardson had sustained life-threatening injuries but would ultimately survive, while Judy Richardson was critically injured and would spend weeks in the hospital recovering from her wounds. Cameron Richardson, the innocent teenager who had stumbled into his parents' bedroom trying to help, was the most seriously injured of all, having been stabbed multiple times in the torso and suffering injuries that would leave him with permanent physical and psychological scars. Jacob Heindel was immediately arrested at the scene, and Chelsea Richardson was taken into custody shortly thereafter when investigators quickly determined that she had been involved in planning the attack. During interrogations, both teenagers confessed to their roles in the crime, though each tried to minimize their own culpability and blame the other for being the primary instigator. Jacob claimed that Chelsea had pressured him into committing the murders, that she had threatened to break up with him if he did not follow through with the plan, and that he had only agreed because he was afraid of losing her. Chelsea, meanwhile, claimed that Jacob had been the one who wanted to kill her parents, and that she had only gone along with his plan out of fear of what he might do to her if she refused. The evidence, however, told a different story, one of 2 teenagers who were equally culpable in planning and attempting to execute a brutal family annihilation for reasons that were astonishingly selfish and trivial. Text messages and social media communications between Chelsea and Jacob revealed months of planning, discussions about how to carry out the murders, and Chelsea's repeated insistence that her parents needed to die so she could be free. In some of these messages, Chelsea expressed excitement about inheriting her parents' money and being able to live independently with Jacob, showing a complete absence of remorse or hesitation about what they were planning to do. The trial proceedings were emotionally devastating for everyone involved, particularly for Scott, Judy, and Cameron Richardson. who had to relive the horror of the attack and confront the fact that Chelsea, their own daughter and sister, had orchestrated the attempt on their lives. The Richardsons provided victim impact statements that were heartbreaking in their description of the physical and emotional trauma they had endured, the betrayal they felt at Chelsea's actions, and the permanent damage that had been done to their family. Scott Richardson described the moment he realized that his daughter had sent an assassin to murder him and his wife, the incomprehensible pain of that betrayal, and the knowledge that his own child valued her freedom and independence more than his life or her mother's life or even her brother's life. Cameron Richardson, who had been an unintended victim and had nearly died trying to help his parents, spoke about the physical scars he would carry forever and the psychological trauma of knowing his own sister had been willing to let him die to cover up her crime. Judy Richardson expressed the profound grief of losing the daughter she thought she knew, and the impossibility of ever trusting or reconciling with someone who had tried to have her murdered. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation, planning, and complete disregard for human life, arguing that both Chelsea and Jacob deserved the harshest possible sentences under the law. The defense attorneys for both teens attempted to portray their clients as immature adolescents who had made a terrible mistake, who had not fully understood the consequences of their actions, and who deserved a chance at rehabilitation. They brought in expert witnesses to discuss teenage brain development, impulse control, and the influence of romantic relationships on adolescent decision-making, arguing that neither teen should be sentenced as harshly as an adult would be for the same crimes. However, the jury and judge found these arguments unpersuasive given the extensive planning involved in the crime, the brutal nature of the attack, and the complete lack of genuine remorse shown by either defendant. In 2010, both Chelsea Richardson and Jacob Heindel were tried as adults and convicted of multiple counts of attempted first-degree murder. Chelsea was sentenced to 40 years in prison, while Jacob received a sentence of 35 years, reflecting the court's determination that Chelsea had been the primary instigator and mastermind behind the plot. The sentences meant that both teenagers would spend the majority of their adult lives in prison, not becoming eligible for release until they were well into their 50s, effectively ensuring that their young adult years would be spent behind bars paying for their crimes. Chelsea Richardson is currently incarcerated in the Florida Department of Corrections, where she is serving her 40-year sentence with no possibility of early release. The Richardson family has had to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of the attack, dealing with physical injuries, psychological trauma, and the permanent fracture of their family unit. The case received significant media attention as yet another example of teenage entitlement and narcissism leading to horrific violence against parents who were guilty of nothing more than trying to raise their children with appropriate boundaries and expectations. Criminal psychologists who have studied the case point to it as an illustration of how a culture of instant gratification, lack of impulse control, and inability to accept authority can create a toxic mindset in some young people that allows them to view murder as an acceptable solution to normal life challenges. The Chelsea Richardson case is particularly disturbing because, unlike some other cases of teenagers killing their parents, there was no history of abuse, no financial desperation, no mental illness that could explain or even partially excuse the crime. Chelsea came from a loving home with parents who cared about her well-being and wanted the best for her future, and she responded to their normal parental oversight by plotting to have them brutally murdered so she could live without rules or restrictions. The case serves as a sobering reminder that evil can exist even in the most unlikely places, that apparent normalcy and success can hide sociopathic tendencies and murderous intent, and that some individuals, even teenagers from good families, are capable of betraying those who love them most in pursuit of selfish goals. For the Richardson family, the scars of that terrible night in March 2010 will never fully heal, and while they survived physically, the emotional and psychological damage of knowing their own daughter tried to orchestrate their deaths remains a burden they carry every day. The case stands as one of the most shocking examples of attempted patricide and matricide in recent American history and demonstrates the absolute worst of what can happen when teenage rebellion, entitlement, and a complete lack of empathy combine into a deadly and tragic result. Number 6. Jasmine Richardson, Canada's youngest multiple murderer. In April 2006, the small city of Medicine Hat in Alberta, Canada, was rocked by one of the most disturbing crimes in the nation's history when 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson helped murder her entire family, making her the youngest person in Canadian history to be convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder. The Richardson family, Mark Richardson, his wife Deborah, and their 2 children Jasmine and 8-year-old Jacob, appeared to be a typical middle-class Canadian family living a quiet life in their Medicine Hat home. Mark worked as a mobile equipment mechanic while Deborah was a devoted mother who homeschooled both children and was actively involved in their lives and activities. The family was close-knit and well-regarded in their community, with neighbors describing them as friendly, normal people who took good care of their children and their home. But in early 2006, Mark and Deborah Richardson began to notice concerning changes in their daughter Jasmine's behavior and appearance that worried them deeply. Jasmine, who had always been a sweet, compliant child, suddenly began dressing in gothic clothing, wearing dark makeup, expressing interest in vampirism and death, and spending large amounts of time on social media and in online chat rooms. Most concerning to her parents was Jasmine's new boyfriend, a 23-year-old man named Jeremy Steinke, who went by the online name cheerleader, and who embodied everything that terrified the Richardsons about their daughter's new interests. Steinke was unemployed, lived a transient lifestyle, claimed to be a 300-year-old werewolf, participated in the local goth scene, and was obviously far too old to be dating their 12-year-old daughter. When Mark and Deborah discovered the relationship between Jasmine and Jeremy, they were horrified and immediately forbade their daughter from seeing him, explaining that the age difference was not only inappropriate but illegal, and that they were acting to protect her from someone who was clearly not a suitable or safe person for her to be involved with. They grounded Jasmine, restricted her internet access, and made it clear that the relationship with Jeremy Steinke was absolutely not acceptable under any circumstances. For most 12-year-olds, parental intervention in a relationship would eventually lead to moving on and finding age-appropriate friends and interests, but Jasmine Richardson responded to her parents' reasonable boundaries with rage, resentment, and a determination to be with Jeremy no matter what the cost. She began communicating with Jeremy through secret means, telling him that her parents were horrible people who were ruining her life and keeping her from true love, and together they began discussing ways to overcome this obstacle to their relationship. These discussions quickly turned from fantasies about running away together to much darker conversations about eliminating Jasmine's parents permanently. Messages exchanged between Jasmine and Jeremy in the weeks leading up to the murders showed a disturbing escalation of violent rhetoric, with Jeremy encouraging Jasmine's anger toward her parents, and both of them discussing in increasingly specific terms how they could kill the entire Richardson family. Jeremy, who was an adult man with a fully developed brain and the ability to understand consequences, should have recognized the insanity and criminality of these discussions and ended the relationship, but instead he fed into Jasmine's fantasies and helped plan a brutal family annihilation that would destroy innocent lives. On the evening of April 23, 2006, the plan was put into action when Jeremy Steinke went to the Richardson home armed with a knife while Jasmine waited outside. The family was home together, with Mark, Deborah, and 8-year-old Jacob going about their normal evening routines, completely unaware that they had been targeted for murder by Jasmine and her adult boyfriend. Jeremy entered the house and launched a vicious attack on Mark Richardson, stabbing him dozens of times in a frenzy of violence that left the father dead in a pool of blood. Deborah Richardson tried to defend herself and her family, but was also stabbed repeatedly, sustaining fatal wounds that killed her within minutes. The most horrific aspect of the attack came next, when 8-year-old Jacob Richardson was hunted down in the house by Jeremy Steinke and murdered, stabbed multiple times as the little boy begged for his life and tried to hide from his killer. Jasmine, who had entered the house during the attack, did not physically participate in the murders according to some accounts, though she was present and encouraging Jeremy, and according to other testimony, she may have actually helped kill her younger brother, with some sources stating that she delivered some of the blows that ended Jacob's life. After the three members of the Richardson family were dead, Jasmine and Jeremy fled the scene together, going to a friend's house where they boasted about the murders, showed off their blood-stained clothing, and seemed to treat the whole event as an exciting adventure rather than the horrific crime it was. When police discovered the bodies at the Richardson home the following day, the scene was described by investigators as one of the worst they had ever encountered, with evidence of extreme violence and the presence of a small child among the victims making it particularly heartbreaking. The investigation immediately focused on finding Jasmine, who was missing from the home and initially believed to be a potential victim who might have been kidnapped by whoever killed her family. However, it did not take long for investigators to uncover the truth about Jasmine's relationship with Jeremy Steinke and to discover the communications between them planning the murders. Within days, both Jasmine and Jeremy were arrested, with Jasmine being taken into custody at a friend's house where she and Jeremy had been hiding out and treating the whole situation as if they were characters in some romantic tragedy rather than murderers who had just slaughtered 3 innocent people, including a defenseless 8-year-old child. During interrogations, Jeremy Steinke confessed to the murders and implicated Jasmine as the mastermind who had wanted her family dead, so she could be free to be with him without interference. Jasmine initially denied involvement, but eventually her role in planning and encouraging the murders became undeniable as investigators uncovered the electronic communications between her and Jeremy that clearly showed her participation in planning the crime. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by Jasmine's age, as Canadian law has specific provisions for handling juvenile offenders, especially those who are under 14 years old at the time of their crimes. Jasmine was just 12 when the murders occurred, making her one of the youngest people ever charged with first-degree murder in Canadian history. Under Canadian law, her identity was protected and she could not be identified publicly by her real name, though this protection would later be lifted after she turned 18. The trial revealed the full scope of the horror that had occurred in the Richardson home, with forensic evidence showing that Mark Richardson had been stabbed 24 times. Deborah had been stabbed multiple times in her chest and neck, and little Jacob had been stabbed 5 times in his small body as he tried to escape from his killers. The brutality of the attacks, combined with the fact that an 8-year-old child had been murdered, created enormous public outrage and demands for harsh punishment for both killers. Jeremy Steinke was tried first and was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, receiving the mandatory sentence of life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, which was the harshest sentence available under Canadian law. Jasmine Richardson's trial followed, and despite her young age, she was also convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, becoming the youngest person in Canadian history to be convicted of multiple murders. However, because she was only 12 at the time of the crimes and therefore subject to the Youth Criminal Justice Act, Jasmine received a much lighter sentence than an adult would have received for the same crimes. She was sentenced to the maximum allowed under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, which was 10 years consisting of 4 years in a psychiatric institution, 4.5 years under conditional supervision in the community, and the remainder of the sentence under various monitoring and reporting requirements. This sentence, which seemed remarkably lenient given the horrific nature of the crimes and the fact that 3 people including a small child were dead, sparked intense debate in Canada about juvenile justice, the appropriate punishment for child murderers, and whether a 12-year-old could truly be rehabilitated after committing such atrocities. Jasmine Richardson completed her sentence in 2016, just 10 years after brutally murdering her parents and younger brother, and she was released back into Canadian society at the age of 22 with a new identity and the opportunity to rebuild her life. The publication ban on her identity remained in effect, protecting her from being publicly identified and allowing her to integrate into society without the stigma of being Canada's youngest multiple murderer. This outcome has been deeply controversial, with victim advocacy groups arguing that 10 years is an insultingly short sentence for someone who helped murder 3 people, and that Jasmine should have faced much harsher consequences for her crimes. Others, particularly those who work in juvenile rehabilitation and child psychology, have argued that 12-year-olds are fundamentally different from adults in terms of brain development, impulse control, and capacity for change, and that Jasmine deserved an opportunity for rehabilitation and a chance at a normal life. The case raises profound questions about criminal responsibility for children, the influence of adults on juvenile offenders, and the appropriate balance between punishment and rehabilitation in the juvenile justice system. Jeremy Steinke, who was an adult at the time of the murders and who physically carried out the killings, remains in prison serving his life sentence and will not be eligible for parole until 2033 at the earliest, having already spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. The Richardson family murders sent shockwaves through Medicine Hat and through Canada more broadly, forcing difficult conversations about internet safety, age-appropriate relationships, parental authority, and the vulnerability of children to predatory adults who groom them for criminal activity. Mark and Deborah Richardson died trying to protect their daughter from a dangerous man, only to have that same daughter help murder them for doing their job as parents. Jacob Richardson, an innocent 8-year-old boy, died because his sister valued her relationship with a 23-year-old man more than she valued her brother's life. The tragedy of the Richardson family massacre serves as a stark reminder that some children, even those as young as 12, are capable of horrific violence when influenced by the wrong people and when their sense of right and wrong becomes distorted by obsession, manipulation, and a complete failure to understand the permanence and horror of death. The case also highlights the responsibility of adults who engage in relationships with children, as Jeremy Steinke's grooming of Jasmine and his willingness to validate her violent fantasies directly led to the deaths of 3 innocent people. Whether Jasmine Richardson has truly been rehabilitated, whether she deserves the chance to live a normal life after serving only 10 years for triple murder, and whether the Canadian justice system struck the right balance between recognizing her youth and holding her accountable for her crimes remains a subject of intense debate more than 15 years after the murders occurred, with no easy answers and no resolution that can undo the permanent damage to the extended Richardson family and the community that lost 3 of its members to senseless violence. Number 7, Mary Bell, the 11-year-old who became Britain's youngest female killer. The case of Mary Bell stands as one of the most disturbing and complex criminal cases in British history, involving a young girl who committed unthinkable acts of violence before she was even old enough to attend secondary school, and whose crimes forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about childhood evil, rehabilitation, and justice. Mary Flora Bell was born on May 26, 1957, in Newcastle upon Tyne, England, into circumstances that would have challenged any child's development. Her mother, Betty Bell, was a sex worker who showed little interest in Mary beyond the income she could potentially generate, and there were persistent rumors and later confirmed accounts that Betty had prostituted Mary to clients from a very young age, subjecting her daughter to sexual abuse and exploitation that would damage her psychologically in profound and lasting ways. Mary's early childhood was marked by chaos, neglect, abuse, and a complete absence of the nurturing and stability that children need to develop normally. Betty Bell was reportedly violent toward Mary, and there were multiple incidents in Mary's early years where she nearly died under suspicious circumstances, including several occasions where she was found unconscious or in medical distress that suggested possible attempts by her mother to harm or kill her. Growing up in poverty in the Newcastle slums of the late 1950s and early 1960s, Mary exhibited behavioral problems from an early age, showing signs of emotional disturbance, difficulty connecting with other children, and what teachers and social workers described as a disturbing lack of normal empathy or emotional response. By the time she was 11 years old, Mary Bell had developed into a deeply troubled child with a propensity for violence and a fascination with death that would soon manifest in the most horrific way possible. On May 25, 1968, one day before Mary's 11th birthday, The body of 4-year-old Martin Brown was found in a derelict house in the Scotswood area of Newcastle. The little boy appeared to have died from natural causes or an accident, and while the death was tragic, there was initially no evidence to suggest foul play. However, in the days following Martin's death, strange events began occurring, including break-ins at a local nursery where notes were left claiming responsibility for the death of Martin Brown. Notes that authorities initially dismissed as sick pranks by disturbed individuals seeking attention. On July 31, 1968, just 2 months after Martin Brown's death, 3-year-old Brian Howe disappeared while playing near his home in the same Scotswood neighborhood. His body was found the following day on a patch of wasteland, and unlike Martin Brown's death, there was no question that Brian had been murdered. The little boy had been strangled to death and his body had been mutilated after death, with cuts made on his thighs, his abdomen cut, and marks carved into his skin, including what appeared to be the letter M carved into his stomach. The brutality of the attack on such a young child shocked the community and launched an intensive police investigation to find the killer. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people in the neighborhood, and eventually their attention turned to Mary Bell and her friend Norma Bell, who was 13 years old and not related to Mary despite sharing the same surname. Both girls had been in the area when Brian Howe disappeared. Both had shown unusual behavior in the aftermath of his death, including making statements that suggested knowledge of details about the murder that had not been made public. And both had been seen near the location where Brian's body was discovered. When police interviewed Mary Bell, they were struck by her completely inappropriate demeanor, as she showed no emotion about the death of a child from her neighborhood, and instead seemed almost excited or proud when discussing the details of the murder. During questioning, Mary made statements that were inconsistent with her claim of innocence, and she displayed a level of knowledge about how Brian had died that she should not have possessed unless she had been involved. The investigation eventually focused primarily on Mary Bell when it became clear that she had been the dominant personality in her friendship with Norma, and that Norma had likely been present during the crimes but had been led or coerced by Mary into participating or witnessing acts she would not have committed on her own. In December 1968, both Mary Bell and Norma Bell were charged with the murders of Martin Brown and Brian Howe, though Norma was ultimately acquitted of all charges while Mary Bell was convicted of 2 counts of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, with the jury determining that Mary had killed both boys but that she lacked the mental capacity to be convicted of full murder due to her age and psychological state. The trial revealed disturbing details about both killings, with evidence showing that Mary had strangled Martin Brown until he died, apparently experimenting with what it would feel like to kill someone, and then 2 months later had strangled Brian Howe and mutilated his body, showing a progression of violence and a complete lack of remorse or empathy. During the trial, psychiatrists testified about Mary's traumatic upbringing, the abuse she had suffered, and the severe psychological damage that had resulted. But they also noted that Mary displayed psychopathic traits including lack of remorse, inability to form genuine emotional connections, manipulativeness, and a disturbing fascination with death and violence. The court heard testimony about Mary's behavior after the murders, including instances where she had approached Brian Howe's mother and asked to see the dead boy's body, where she had laughed and joked about the deaths, and where she had returned to the crime scenes apparently to relive or enjoy her crimes. At just 11 years old, Mary Bell was convicted of 2 counts of manslaughter and was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, which meant she would be held in secure facilities indefinitely until authorities determined she was no longer a danger to society. The case shocked Britain and the world, as the idea that an 11-year-old girl could be capable of murdering 2 small children was almost incomprehensible to the public and forced difficult conversations about childhood violence, the age of criminal responsibility, and how society should handle children who commit heinous crimes. Mary Bell spent 12 years in various juvenile detention facilities and prisons, during which time she received extensive psychological treatment and education designed to rehabilitate her and prepare her for eventual release. In 1980, at the age of 23, Mary Bell was released from custody with a new identity and placed under a lifelong anonymity order designed to protect her from vigilante violence and to allow her to attempt to build a normal life. The decision to release Mary Bell after only 12 years for 2 murders sparked significant controversy, with many people arguing that she should have remained in prison for life and that releasing her after such a relatively short period minimized the horror of her crimes and disrespected the victims and their families. Since her release, Mary Bell has lived under various assumed names in different parts of Britain, and the anonymity order has been extended to protect not only Mary but also her daughter, who was born after Mary's release and who had no connection to her mother's crimes. Mary Bell has reportedly lived a quiet, law-abiding life since her release, has never reoffended, and has attempted as much as possible to distance herself from her past and build a normal existence. In 1998, Mary Bell collaborated with writer Gitta Sereni on a book about her life and crimes titled Cries Unheard, which caused enormous controversy as it was seen by many as profiting from her crimes and as giving a platform to someone who had murdered 2 innocent children. The mothers of Martin Brown and Brian Howe were deeply hurt by the book's publication and by what they saw as Mary Bell's attempt to excuse her actions by focusing on her own victimization as a child. The debate around Mary Bell's case continues to this day, more than 50 years after the murders, with people taking different positions on whether an 11-year-old can be truly evil or whether Mary was herself a victim of such severe abuse that her capacity for moral development was destroyed before she ever had a chance. Criminal psychologists and child development experts have studied the Mary Bell case extensively, with some arguing that she represents a rare example of true psychopathy emerging in childhood, possibly due to a combination of genetic factors and extreme environmental trauma, while others contend that Mary was a deeply damaged child who acted out in violent ways because of the horrific abuse she suffered, and that her rehabilitation and successful reintegration into society proves that even child murderers can change. The case has implications for how criminal justice systems around the world handle juvenile offenders, particularly those who commit serious violent crimes at very young ages, and raises questions about the purpose of punishment, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the protection of society versus the rights and potential of child offenders. The families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe have never received full justice or closure, as the boy's killer was released after just 12 years and has lived the majority of her life as a free woman with a protected identity and the opportunity to build a family and career, opportunities that Martin and Brian will never have because their lives were cut short by senseless violence. The Mary Bell case serves as one of the most troubling examples of child-on-child violence in modern history and challenges our fundamental assumptions about innocence, childhood, evil, and redemption, forcing us to confront the reality that sometimes children are capable of monstrous acts, and that deciding how to respond to such cases requires balancing competing values of justice, rehabilitation, and public safety in ways that satisfy no one and leave permanent scars on families and communities.